Seven Little Johnstons family. Liz and Bryce Bolden of Seven Little Johnstons have finally tied the knot, and the photos from their special day were truly eye-catching and heartwarming. Every moment was filled with love, joy, and a unique atmosphere of starting a new life that touched the hearts of fans. However, there is a bit of mystery in the midst of the joy, as some of the wedding photos have been suddenly removed. Why was this done? This question is now on the minds of many. Although fans are curious about the matter, Liz did not want to say much about it. He briefly stated, "This is my personal matter. I don't want to talk about it." His comment suggests that he wants to keep the matter private. Overall, the joyous moments of their wedding are a source of joy for fans, but they also leave some unanswered questions, which may or may not be answered in time. The golden afternoon sun stretched gently across the wide countryside venue where Liz Johnston and Bryce Bolden stood hand in hand, surrounded by soft laughter, delicate music, and the quiet hum of anticipation, as if the world itself had paused just long enough to witness the beginning of something deeply meaningful and beautifully uncertain. A new chapter that neither of them could fully predict, yet both were ready to embrace with open hearts and unwavering faith. Their wedding was not just an event. It was an experience layered with emotion, carefully chosen details, and moments that seemed to glow with a kind of sincerity that could not be staged, as friends and family gathered under elegant floral arches, their smiles reflecting both pride and nostalgia. Because everyone present understood that this was more than a celebration of love. It was the merging of two lives shaped by very different journeys, yet somehow destined to meet at this precise moment in time. Liz, dressed in a gown that shimmered subtly with every step she took, carried herself with a quiet confidence that masked the storm of emotions inside her, because although she had dreamed of this day for years, she also understood that marriage was not just about romance, but about commitment, compromise, and the courage to grow alongside another person, even when life became complicated. While Bryce, standing across from her with a mixture of awe and nervous excitement, could hardly believe that the path that had once seemed uncertain had led him here, to this exact place, to this exact person. As vows were exchanged, their voices trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the overwhelming weight of the promises they were making. Promises that extended far beyond the beautifully decorated venue and into the unpredictable future that awaited them. And for a moment, everything else faded. The cameras, the guests, the world outside, and all that remained was the connection between two people choosing each other again and again in a single, unforgettable moment. The celebration that followed was vibrant and full of life, filled with music that carried laughter into the night and conversations that wove together past memories with future hopes, while photographs were taken endlessly, capturing smiles, tears, and fleeting expressions that would later serve as reminders of a day that felt almost too perfect to be real. And as flashes lit up the evening, it seemed as though every second was being preserved, every emotion carefully framed, so it could be revisited whenever nostalgia called. However, as the days passed and those cherished wedding photos began to circulate among fans and followers, something unexpected happened. Some of the images, once proudly displayed, quietly disappeared, vanishing from public view without explanation, leaving behind a subtle but undeniable sense of curiosity that quickly grew into widespread speculation. Because in a world where every moment is often shared openly, silence can sometimes speak louder than words. Fans began to notice the gaps, the missing glimpses of what had once been visible, and questions started to form. Not out of malice, but MTVKH's genuine interest and emotional investment, as people who had followed Liz's journey felt connected to her story and wanted to understand what had changed, what had prompted the removal of those carefully captured memories that had once symbolized such joy. Yet, despite the growing curiosity, Liz chose to remain reserved, offering only a brief acknowledgement without diving into details, her response gentle but firm, as she explained that some things were personal and not meant for public discussion. And while this answer did not satisfy everyone, it carried a quiet strength, a reminder that even in the age of constant sharing, boundaries still matter, and not every story needs to be told in full. Behind that decision, in this fictional telling, lay a deeper and more emotional truth. one that was not rooted in scandal or conflict, but in the realization that some moments are too meaningful to be filtered through public perception, moments that lose their authenticity when exposed to endless interpretation, and perhaps within those removed photos were fragments of vulnerability, private expressions, family interactions, or subtle emotions that Liz wished to preserve in their purest form, untouched by outside opinions. Bryce, standing beside her through both the celebration and the aftermath, respected that choice completely, understanding that love is not only about sharing happiness, but also about protecting what matters most, and together they navigated the attention with quiet unity, choosing to focus not on the questions being asked, but on the life they were building, step by step, beyond the lens of cameras and the reach of social media. As time moved forward, the mystery of the missing photos slowly became less important than the reality of their marriage, because while curiosity fades, genuine connection endures, and the true story of Liz and Bryce was never confined to a collection of images, but lived instead in the everyday moments. The laughter shared over simple things, the challenges faced together, and the quiet understanding that grew stronger with each passing day. In the end, their wedding remained a beautiful memory, not because every detail was publicly known, but because it marked the beginning of something real, something evolving, something imperfect yet deeply meaningful. And perhaps that was the most important lesson hidden within the story, that love does not need to be fully seen to be fully felt. And sometimes, the most powerful parts of a journey are the ones kept gently out of sight, protected like a secret that only two hearts truly understand. The wedding had been nothing short of magical, a day wrapped in golden sunlight and soft laughter, where every glance, every whispered word, and every shared smile seemed to promise a future filled with love. Yet beneath the carefully arranged flowers and the perfectly rehearsed vows, there lingered an invisible thread of mystery that no one could quite grasp, but everyone could somehow feel, like a quiet echo hidden behind the music. From the very beginning, people had been enchanted by their story, a love that appeared effortless and pure, the kind that made others believe in forever again. And as the bride walked down the aisle with a gentle smile that shimmered like morning dew, and the groom stood waiting with eyes full of emotion, the world seemed to pause just long enough to witness something truly special, something that felt almost too perfect to question. And yet, as the celebrations unfolded, as glasses clinked and laughter filled the air, there were small moments, barely noticeable, fleeting as a shadow, that hinted at something deeper, something unspoken, like the brief hesitation before a smile, or the way certain conversations would abruptly change direction, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than words. It was not until after the wedding, when the photos began to circulate among fans and followers, that the first real sign of mystery appeared, because while most of the images captured joy and beauty in its purest form, a few suddenly vanished without explanation, disappearing as though they had never existed at all, and this unexpected absence sparked a quiet storm of curiosity that spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. People began to ask questions, gently at first, then with growing intensity, wondering why such beautiful moments would be hidden away, what story lay behind those missing frames, and whether there was something more to this seemingly perfect union than what had been shown to the world. But every question was met with the same calm yet firm response. "This is my personal matter. I don't want to talk about it." The words were simple, almost too simple, yet they carried a weight that silenced even the most persistent voices, as though they were not just a refusal, but a boundary drawn with quiet strength, a reminder that not every story is meant to be shared, not every truth meant to be revealed. Still, the human heart is naturally drawn to mystery, and so the silence only deepened the intrigue, leading people to create their own versions of the truth, weaving together fragments of imagination and assumption, crafting stories that ranged from heartbreak to hidden conflicts, from family disagreements to secrets too fragile to expose, each theory more elaborate than the last, yet none able to touch the reality that remained locked behind closed doors. Meanwhile, life moved forward for the newlyweds, at least on the surface, as they continued to share glimpses of their journey, small snapshots of happiness that reassured their supporters while revealing nothing more than what they chose to show, maintaining a delicate balance between openness and privacy that few could truly understand. In quiet moments, away from the gaze of others, there were conversations that no one would ever hear, emotions that could not be captured in photographs, and decisions shaped not by public expectation, but by personal truth, because love, in its most real form, is not always perfect, and sometimes it carries complexities that cannot be explained without losing their meaning. Perhaps the missing photos were not signs of something broken, but rather reflections of something deeply human. Moments that were too personal, too raw, or too significant to be turned into public memories, moments that belonged only to those who lived them, untouched by the curiosity of the outside world. Or perhaps there was indeed a story hidden within those vanished images, a story that time itself would choose whether or not to reveal, because not all answers come immediately, and some truths unfold slowly, like a flower that blooms only when the season is right. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the questions gradually softened, fading into the background as new stories took their place, yet the mystery remained, quietly resting in the hearts of those who had once wondered, a reminder that even the most joyful moments can carry shadows, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that are never fully told. And in the end, perhaps that is what made their wedding unforgettable. Not just the love that was celebrated, but the silence that followed. A silence that spoke of boundaries, of choices, and of the quiet strength it takes to protect what matters most, even when the world is watching. However, the golden light of a late summer evening stretched across the quiet suburban street as the Johnston house stood filled with a kind of silence that did not come from peace, but from everything that had been left unsaid over the years. And inside those walls lived not just a family, but a collection of intertwined hearts, each carrying its own version of love, longing, and quiet heartbreak that no one fully understood, not even themselves. Liz stood by the window of her room, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the glass as she watched the sky shift from soft orange to deep blue. And although everything in her life seemed to be moving forward, new responsibilities, new relationships, new expectations, there was still a lingering feeling inside her chest that something important had been lost somewhere along the way, something she could not name but felt in every quiet moment when she was alone. Bryce had once been that feeling of certainty for her, the kind of love that felt simple and warm like sunlight on a winter morning. But as time passed and life grew more complicated, their connection had begun to stretch thin, like a thread pulled too tight. And although they still smiled at each other and said all the right things, there were spaces between their words that neither of them knew how to fill anymore. Across the house, Anna sat on the edge of her bed with her phone resting beside her, the screen lighting up occasionally with messages she chose not to read right away, because sometimes it felt easier to pretend the world could wait than to face the emotions that came rushing in every time she opened her heart to someone who might not understand her. And even though she told herself she was strong and independent, there were nights when the loneliness felt heavier than anything she had ever carried before. She thought about love often, not in the dreamy, perfect way people talked about it, but in a more complicated way, like something beautiful that could also hurt you deeply, like something that asked you to be brave, even when you were afraid of being broken. And she wondered if she would ever find someone who could see her completely and still choose to stay. Meanwhile, in the living room, Trent and Amber sat side by side, their conversation quiet and slow, filled with pauses that held years of shared memories. And although their relationship had weathered countless storms and challenges, there were still moments when they looked at each other and saw not just who they were now, but who they had once been. Two people full of dreams, unsure of the future, but certain of each other. "Do you ever wonder," Amber said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "if we did everything right?" Trent didn't answer immediately, because he knew there was no simple answer to a question like that, and after a long moment, he sighed and said, "I think we did the best we could with what we knew at the time." And even though his words were meant to bring comfort, there was a quiet sadness behind them, the kind that comes from realizing that love alone doesn't always make things easy. Back upstairs, Liz found herself scrolling through old photos, moments captured in laughter, in celebrations, in times when everything felt whole. And as she looked at a picture of herself and Bryce smiling together, she felt a sudden ache in her chest. Not because the memory was bad, but because it reminded her of how much things had changed, and how sometimes love doesn't end with a dramatic goodbye, but slowly fades into something quieter and harder to define. She wanted to believe that love was supposed to last, that it was meant to grow stronger with time. But the truth she was beginning to understand was that love also requires effort, communication, and a willingness to face difficult truths. And without those things, even the strongest feelings can begin to drift apart. At the same time, Anna finally picked up her phone and opened a message she had been avoiding, her heart beating a little faster as she read the words. And although the message was simple, it carried a weight that made her pause, because it was from someone who had once meant a lot to her, someone who had walked away when things became complicated, and now they were reaching out again, as if time could erase everything that had happened between them. She stared at the screen for a long time, her thoughts tangled in a mix of hope and hesitation, because part of her wanted to respond, to believe that people could change and that love could come back stronger, but another part of her was afraid of reopening wounds that had taken so long to heal. And in that moment, she realized that sometimes the hardest part of love is not falling in, but deciding whether it is worth risking your heart again. Downstairs, the house remained quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now, one filled with reflection rather than tension, as if each person was lost in their own thoughts, trying to make sense of their feelings and the paths their lives were taking. And although they were all under the same roof, each of them was on a deeply personal journey through love and heartbreak. As the night grew darker, Liz stepped outside into the cool air, her breath visible in the faint light, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel everything she had been holding back. The confusion, the sadness, the longing for something she wasn't sure she could have again. And instead of pushing those feelings away, she let them exist, because she was beginning to understand that heartbreak is not a sign of failure, but a part of loving deeply. At the same time, Anna typed a reply to the message on her phone, her fingers hesitating for just a second before she pressed send, not because she was certain of what would happen next, but because she was choosing to be open to the possibility of something new, even if it came with risks. And in that small moment, she felt a quiet sense of courage that reminded her she was stronger than her fears. Inside, Trent and Amber turned off the lights and headed upstairs, their hands brushing against each other as they walked, a simple gesture that carried years of connection. And although their journey had not been perfect, it was real. And sometimes that is what matters most. Not perfection, but persistence, not flawless love, but enduring love. And as the house finally settled into sleep, the night held all of their stories gently within it, the beginnings, the endings, the uncertain in-betweens, reminding them that love is never just one thing, but a complex, ever-changing experience that can bring both joy and pain, growth and loss, and that even in heartbreak, there is always the possibility of healing, of learning, and of finding a new way forward. Because in the end, the Johnston family was not defined by their struggles or their mistakes, but by their willingness to keep loving even when it was difficult, even when it hurt, and even when they didn't have all the answers. And perhaps that is what makes their story not just one of romance and heartbreak, but one of resilience, hope, and the quiet strength it takes to open your heart again and again, no matter what life brings. However, the warm evening air wrapped itself gently around the Johnston household as the golden light of the setting sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows across the living room where Trent sat quietly, his expression more serious than usual, his fingers tapping slowly against the arm of his chair as he tried to gather his thoughts. Because this was not just another casual conversation or a lighthearted family discussion, but something that weighed heavily on his mind and heart, something that involved his daughter Liz and her growing independence, and more importantly, her relationship with Bryce, which seemed to be moving faster than he was comfortable with. Liz, on the other hand, stood near the doorway, her arms crossed but her posture firm, as if she had already prepared herself for the resistance she knew was coming. Because deep down she understood her father well enough to anticipate his concerns, yet she also felt a strong need to assert her own decisions, her own life choices, and her own vision of the future she wanted to build. especially now that she was no longer a child and had begun to see herself as someone capable of making serious commitments, even if those commitments challenged the boundaries her parents had carefully set over the years. Bryce arrived shortly after, stepping into the house with a polite smile that carried a hint of nervousness, because while he respected Trent and Amber deeply, he was fully aware that this conversation was about him just as much as it was about Liz. And he knew that earning Trent's trust was not something that could be rushed or taken lightly, especially when it came to something as significant as moving in together, which in Trent's eyes was not just a practical decision, but a deeply emotional and moral step that required careful consideration. As everyone gathered in the living room, the atmosphere became noticeably tense, the kind of silence that felt louder than words, until Trent finally spoke, his voice calm but firm, explaining that while he cared about both Liz and Bryce and appreciated the bond they had built, he did not believe it was the right time for them to take such a big step, emphasizing that moving in together was not just about convenience or saving money, but about responsibility, commitment, and the kind of maturity that he felt still needed time to develop. Liz listened, her eyes reflecting a mixture of frustration and determination, because to her, this was not about rushing into something blindly, but about growing together, about learning to navigate life side by side, and about proving that she was capable of making decisions that aligned with her own values and aspirations, even if they differed from her father's expectations. And as she responded, her voice carried a quiet strength as she tried to explain that she wasn't asking for permission in the way she once did as a child, but rather for understanding and support as an adult. Bryce, standing slightly behind Liz, chose his words carefully when he finally spoke, expressing his respect for Trent's concerns while also sharing his own perspective, explaining that his intentions were sincere and that he cared deeply for Liz, not just in a romantic sense, but in a way that made him want to build a stable and supportive life with her, even if that meant facing difficult conversations like this one, because he believed that honesty and openness were essential in earning trust. Trent sighed, leaning back slightly as he processed everything that had been said, because part of him understood where they were coming from. Part of him could see the genuine connection between them, but another part of him, the part that had spent years protecting and guiding his children, found it difficult to let go, to accept that Liz was stepping into a phase of life where his role would inevitably change, where he could no longer control every decision, but instead had to learn to trust the values he had instilled in her. Amber watched quietly, her presence steady and thoughtful, occasionally stepping in to ease the tension, reminding everyone that this was not a battle to be won, but a conversation to be understood, encouraging Trent to listen not just as a father, but as someone who once had to make similar choices in his own life, and encouraging Liz to recognize that her father's resistance came from a place of love rather than control, even if it sometimes felt restrictive. As the conversation continued, emotions rose and fell like waves. Moments of disagreement followed by moments of reflection, until gradually, the sharp edges of conflict began to soften, replaced by a more open and honest exchange of thoughts and feelings, where Trent admitted that his fears were rooted in wanting the best for Liz, in wanting to ensure that she did not face unnecessary hardships, while Liz acknowledged that she still valued her parents' guidance even as she sought to carve out her own path. By the end of the evening, no final decision was made, but something important had shifted, because it was no longer just about whether Bryce would move in or not, but about understanding, respect, and the evolving relationship between a father and his daughter, who were both learning, in their own ways, how to navigate the delicate balance between holding on and letting go, between protecting and trusting, and between the past that shaped them and the future that awaited them. And as the night settled in and the house grew quiet, Trent sat alone for a moment, reflecting on everything that had been said, realizing that while he might not be ready to fully accept the idea yet, he was beginning to see it not as a threat, but as a sign that Liz was growing into the person he had always hoped she would become. Someone strong, independent, and capable of making her own choices, even if those choices challenged him, because in the end, that was what being a parent was truly about. However, in a quiet evening that seemed no different from the countless others the Johnston family had shared together, the atmosphere inside the house carried a subtle tension that no one could quite explain, as if something unspoken was waiting to surface. And it was during this moment that Jonah finally gathered the courage to open up about an experience he had kept buried deep within himself, an experience that had changed him in ways he was only beginning to understand. And as the family sat together, their attention slowly shifting toward him, Jonah took a deep breath and began to explain what had really happened on that confusing and frightening night when his reaction to synthetic marijuana spiraled far beyond anything he had expected. He spoke slowly at first, his voice uncertain but determined, explaining how what started as a moment of curiosity and poor judgment quickly turned into something overwhelming and terrifying, as he described the way his heart began to race uncontrollably, how his thoughts became distorted and tangled in ways that made it impossible to separate reality from imagination, and how a deep sense of panic took over his body, leaving him feeling trapped inside his own mind without any sense of control or understanding of what was happening to him. And as he continued, the room grew quieter, the weight of his words settling over everyone as they realized just how serious the situation had been. Jonah went on to describe how the experience didn't just end when the immediate effects wore off, but instead lingered in his mind like a shadow that followed him into the days and nights that came after, affecting his sleep, his mood, and even his sense of self, as he admitted that he felt embarrassed and ashamed for what had happened, worried about how his family would react and whether they would see him differently, and yet at the same time he knew that keeping it hidden was only making things worse, creating a distance between him and the people who cared about him the most. As he spoke, his parents listened carefully, their expressions shifting from concern to understanding, realizing that this was not just a story about a mistake, but a moment of vulnerability and growth. And Trent leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm, reminding Jonah that everyone makes mistakes, but what truly matters is how you learn from them and move forward, while Amber's eyes softened as she reassured him that he was not alone and that the family would face this together, no matter how difficult it might be. The conversation continued, growing deeper and more honest with each passing moment, as Jonah explained how the experience had forced him to reflect on his choices and the kind of person he wanted to become, admitting that it had been a wake-up call that made him realize the importance of responsibility and self-awareness. And although the memory of that night still unsettled him, he began to see it as a turning point rather than just a mistake, a moment that pushed him to understand himself better and to make decisions that aligned with his values and goals. Meanwhile, his siblings listened quietly, each of them processing the story in their own way. Some surprised, others concerned, but all of them recognizing the courage it took for Jonah to share something so personal. And as the discussion unfolded, it became clear that this was more than just a confession. It was a moment of connection, a reminder that even in difficult situations, honesty and support can bring people closer together rather than driving them apart. As the evening went on, the tension that had once filled the room slowly faded, replaced by a sense of relief and understanding. And Jonah, who had started the conversation feeling nervous and unsure, now felt a weight lifting off his shoulders, as if speaking the truth had allowed him to finally breathe again. And although he knew that rebuilding trust and moving forward would take time, he also knew that he was not facing it alone. In the days that followed, the impact of that conversation continued to ripple through the family, influencing the way they communicated and supported each other as they became more open about their struggles and more willing to listen without judgment. And for Jonah, the experience became a lesson that stayed with him, not as a source of shame, but as a reminder of how quickly things can change and how important it is to make thoughtful choices. And so, what began as a frightening and confusing moment eventually transformed into something meaningful, a story not just about a bad reaction, but about growth, honesty, and the strength of family, showing that even in the most difficult situations, there is always an opportunity to learn, to heal, and to become stronger than before. Hello, lovely viewers. Welcome to my channel. I am Sabrina. Hope your day is so well. If you liked the video, don't forget to subscribe.